I set myself up. Okay, I'm hoping that you all see me. Someone give me a signal if you don't see me. Good afternoon again, and welcome to our worship this afternoon. Today we'll be ending off our series on the book of Acts 27, a topic that I think all of us deal with. But before I start, I want to just give a quick reference. There's two books that help inspire and in my preparation that I want to kind of share with you, okay, for those who like to read. There's a book by Tim Keller in terms of walking with God through pain and suffering. The other one is by Brother Lawrence, Practicing the Presence of God. That's Tim Keller, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, and Brother Lawrence, Practicing the Presence of God. All of us go through struggles and pain, and we give it a name. Generally, we give it a name, and we name it storms. And I don't doubt for a minute many of us are going through storms right now. I've journeyed with my friend who has suffered for over 30 years with something called OCD, also known as obsessive compulsive disorder. The definition is this, that OCD is a disorder in which people have recurring unwanted thoughts, ideas, or sensations. These are their obsessions that make them feel driven to do something repetitively, and these are their compulsions. And sadly, it seems to become worse for him as he's got older. And sadly, I have failed to support him as well. From a mixture of control issues mixed in with impatience, with a lack of listening and understanding. But because of God's grace, somehow we still remain friends. So a question comes to mind for today. How does one like my friend live through his daily suffering? And how does one begin to support others who are suffering? We read today the Acts 27, and the last few chapters of Acts can be called the sufferings of Paul, because it's one bad thing to Paul after another. And he's already gone through 3 storms. Paul's on his way to Rome because he's appealed to Rome because he thinks he can't get a fair trial anywhere else around Judea. And here it says that he's caught in something called a nor'easter, which is essentially a hurricane, and everyone's afraid for their lives, because we can see in verse 20, it was days that they were in that this happened. The storm which was part of Paul's suffering. It represents all suffering, because all suffering in our lives is like storms. And watching Paul deal with his storm can teach us how we can deal with our storms, which includes all our troubles and suffering. And there's just 3 points that I want to ponder with you. That is the paradox of storms, the purposes of storms, and the presence that Paul finds in storms. And if we can see how Paul deals with his storms, then we might be able to figure out how to deal with our own storms. So first, let's talk about the paradox in storms. So what do I mean by this? A paradox is a statement or a proposition or a situation that it just seems illogical, absurd, or self-contradictory, maybe a mystery, but which upon further scrutiny, it may be logical or true, or at least contain an element of truth. Let me explain that let's look at verse 22 again. It says, "But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me.'" But then you take a look at verses 30 and 31. You see the sailors they're obviously afraid, because they're abandoning the ship by secretly lowering the lifeboats. But Paul says to the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. What Paul is trying to say is that we need these sailors to survive. You guys are just soldiers, and you're not trained to be sailors. So we can't be saved unless those sailors stay. Wait a minute. Did you notice something? So first of all, we read that Paul says it's certain God has spoken and has a plan that nobody's going to die. And in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18, it says that if a prophet makes a prophecy in the name of God and it doesn't come true, he should be killed. So Paul would not have said this unless he was really sure and not doubt God has planned it. And yet, when he sees the sailors leaving, he says, unless these guys stay in the boat, we can't be saved. Huh? Do you see a problem? Now, I think the reason that we would see a problem is because we are what I would describe as either or people, however you want to pronounce it, which means that there's a choice between two different plans of action, but both together, they're not possible. Well, in our minds, that is. And I'll explain a bit further after this. So in our minds, if God is totally in charge and there's no way that anybody's going to die, then we think, well, who cares what we do? Now, if that was the case, Paul would have said, well, who cares what the sailors do? They can go scuba diving. Obviously, they're not going to go scuba diving back then. In our minds, if God is totally in charge, then our choices, they totally don't matter. Or we believe if what we do matters and our choices have consequences, then God is holding back, or he's not in control. You see, that's why I would describe us as either or people. But Paul, as much as well as the rest of the Bible, I would describe him as a both and people. And Paul is assuming on one hand that everything that happens, small and bad things, are determined by God. And yet our choices matter. They have consequences, and we are responsible in what we do still. You see, you and I, we either say it's 100% God's in charge and 0% what matters what I do, or some will say 100% I'm free to what I do and 0% God's in charge. Now, some may be like 50-50, some may be 80-20, but Paul is saying here that God is 100% in charge, and you and I are 100% responsible for what we do. In Genesis, Jacob, he lies to his father. He gets his brother angry, and he has to flee for his life. He's really upset, of course, and he never really sees his mother again. So he really screws up his life in many ways, and yet he has children, and one of those descendants is the Messiah. So what Jacob did was wrong, and it had consequences, but it was part of God's plan to bring Jesus the Messiah. Messiah wasn't plan B, it was plan A. Now, does that mean what Jacob did was okay? No, it was wrong. He screwed up his life, and yet God used it. In Acts chapter 2, verse 23, in the very first sermon, Peter looks at the people and he says, "This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross." Paul is saying, was Jesus' death planned by God? Yes. And yet everyone that slew him was wicked. So you might be saying, well, everyone that did it, they were used by God. They had to do it. Well, yes, they did, but it was still their choice. God ordains exactly what is supposed to come to pass through our free choices, and which we are responsible for. But it's really important when suffering and troubles happen to understand and know this paradox, that what we do matters and has consequences still. But at the same time, know that there is a plan, that things are not out of control. God knows what he's doing. When we observe Paul, he appears calm. He's calm because he knows God is in control. He's not being passive, saying, well, it's all rigged anyway by God, so it doesn't matter what I do. The main reason why it's important to know this paradox, that God is 100% in control, and that he has a plan and a purpose for everything, and what I do has consequences, is because it compels me. It compels me to not be passive in my choices and my decisions, but it's also comforting to know that I can't screw up my life in the end. Now let's talk about the purpose in storms. God has a general and specific purpose for the storms we go through. The general purpose is for good. It's for good. And the specific is for godliness. In the story of Jacob, he has 12 sons, but his favorite is Joseph. He spoils Joseph, and as the children grew up, the family is messed up because that's what favoritism does to a family. So Joseph, he grows up spoiled, cruel and shallow, and the other brothers, they're growing up hard and competitive and angry. So finally, the brothers, they find him in some remote place where nobody can see, and they sell Joseph into slavery in Egypt. So Joseph works hard, but it doesn't matter because someone falsely accuses him, and he's thrown into a dungeon in prison. So in the middle of the story, Joseph has had bad thing after another happen to him, and he's praying out of the dungeon, and God doesn't seem to hear him at all. But it's only because he's sold into slavery, and only because he's put into that prison, that he meets people that he meets, and he does the things that he needs to do in order to ascend and become powerful in Egypt, where he puts together a hunger relief program. And in the end, it's only because those bad things happen that thousands are saved from starvation. Jacob's family is saved from starvation, and Jacob himself becomes a great person, and he escapes the future that he had as a spoiled brat, and his relationship with his family is healed as well. In other words, if all the bad didn't happen, the good things wouldn't have happened. At the very end of the story, in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, he says this: you meant it for evil. He says this to his brothers, his family. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. This is almost exactly what Paul says in Romans 8:28, where it says, all things work together for good for those that love God. Now, it doesn't say that everything is good or every cloud has a silver lining, but it's saying that God will work out everything, even the things with evil intent, to accomplish the opposite of what evil wanted to accomplish. So God is at work behind the scenes, using evil to accomplish something opposite of what evil originally intended. And that is God's purpose in all storms. In the story of Job, in the book of Job, Satan, he comes to God and he says, you see that guy, Job? You think he's a good servant of yours? Well, I want to attack him and show him that he's not really a good guy. So God says, okay, go ahead. And some of us, from first reading, are probably thinking, oh my, why would God allow this to happen? So the next day, Satan comes back and says, yes, I attacked him, and he did pretty good. But let me attack him again, just to show you that he's really a phony. And God says, okay, go ahead. And we're all here thinking, oh man, what's going on with God? This is the God that I believe in. This is the God that you want me to believe in, and he's allowing Satan to attack. But you may notice something in the end of the story of Job. Now, Job is a long story of a lot of suffering if you can make it through. But at the end of the story, God just lets Satan intend something, but accomplishes the total opposite. Now, the other person we can look at is Jesus himself. Think about how great Jesus was. If you were following Jesus back then, you'd be thinking, wow, look at him. He's healing the sick. He's raising the dead. He's giving sight to the blind. He's feeding the hungry. And yet he's dying on the cross. So you have people saying, I don't see how God could bring any good out of this. But of course, all the horrible things that happened to Jesus, the anger of the world, the religious authorities wanting to kill him, and the fury of Satan, all the evil that occurred to Jesus on that day, it accomplished the exact opposite of what it wanted. If you think about it, it accomplishes salvation of the world, atonement of our sins, resurrection, conquering over death. But why is it that almost nobody would say, I don't believe in God because God just let Jesus die? I think almost nobody would say that because we all know the reasons based on the end of the story of this book we read. Because when we know the end of the story, we understand why God allowed that torture and suffering to happen in Jesus' life. But we do ask, I don't understand why God is allowing my storms to happen. We all ask that in some way. But remember, there is a book for each of us too. It's just not here yet. You meant it for evil. God meant it for good. All things work together for the good of those that love God according to his good and perfect purpose. And that is the principle. God created the world without evil and death. That wasn't his intention. We know that. But because we turn from him, there's evil and suffering and death. But God didn't abandon us. And here's how he does it. He's exercising his power over history in such a way that in the long run, our free choices and all the evil and suffering that is in this world and all its intentions, he's going to overrule it. So that in the end, it's going to backfire and all evil intended will result in the exact opposite. Unfortunately, most of us, we don't get to be like Joseph to see all the reasons why God let our storms to happen. But here's the reason why you're in the storm. It's for good. It's for good. But the other reason, which is the specific reason, to grow in godliness. Look at verse 34. So Paul is encouraging everyone there. And when Luke, we know Luke's in there because throughout the whole book of Acts, he uses the word we a lot. So we can safely assume that Luke is in the boat hearing Paul, and he hears Paul say this, not a hair on your head will perish. He must have been thinking about the place in Luke chapter 21, verse 18, where Jesus says, some of you will be put to death, and yet not a hair on your head will perish, and yet in patient endurance, you will possess your souls. What Jesus is saying, in the end, unless you suffer, you don't really possess your soul. If you live for something like your job owns you, because if anything goes wrong with your job, your heart is so vulnerable and you feel so devastated and just lost. If you live for anything but God, you don't possess your own soul. And that is other things will own you. Other things will have you. Other things will have the title to your heart. Only if you love God, and God's love is the most important thing in your life, that you'll be able to handle storms. We can see Paul. He has possession of his heart and soul. This is his third shipwreck, but he remains calm. When a storm happens to you, we either spend the rest of the day or our life in self-pity, bitterness, and discouragement, or we can reinvest our hearts in Jesus. Storms will rattle you, but when you take your heart and base it on Jesus, the next storm that hits you, you'll find that you'll be okay. In faithful endurance, in suffering, you possess your soul. People who haven't suffered, they don't know themselves. They don't know their strengths and weaknesses. They can't empathize or sympathize with other people. They're shallow. Patient endurance gives you gives you possession of your soul. These are some of the purposes of storms. But suffering doesn't automatically make you a better person. It doesn't automatically give you possession of your soul, because unfortunately some people come out of suffering more angry and bitter, while some others come out much stronger. There's a saying, the same sun can melt wax, but also harden clay, which is a way to say that the same experience can make somebody and also break somebody else. So how was Paul able to come through a storm better off than worse off? I think it's because he practices the presence of God in the storm. When the storm comes, most of us would say, I think God has abandoned me. If you think that if you think that way, that he's a bad God or just doesn't care, that's going to be the main thing on your minds and your hearts. Or you maybe be thinking it's because of sin in my life that I'm being punished for. But that's not what Paul is saying. Look at verse 22. He says, an angel of God to whom I belong, whom I serve, stood beside me. When we look at this carefully, this is covenant language. This means that when God enters into a covenant relationship with his people, he says, now you will be my people and I will be your God. So we don't usually say stuff like my Sally, my Barbara, my Matthew, unless it's about a person of intimacy, like somebody you were married to, your son or your daughter. And here Paul is, who's saying in the middle of the storm, I know I'm God's. I belong to him. He's mine. He loves me and he's committed to me. You see, Paul doesn't make the mistake that we often do when bad things happen. We tend to say, God's punishing me or God doesn't care. But Paul is saying, no, God is with me. And because he practices God's presence, he knows God's love in the midst of the storms, and he remembers God's faithfulness, the storm, it makes him better, not bitter. The suffering makes him stronger, not sour. But what can this look like for us? So I was saying the book by Brother Lawrence. He was a monk in the 16th century. He said this: little things for the love of God, who regards not the greatness of the work, but the love with which it is performed. So that means that you keep God in the forefront of your mind when you're doing small things, like taking out the garbage, washing the dishes, doing laundry, ironing, brushing your teeth, or doing any number of menial activities. So you pick one ordinary task you do with consistency, with regularity, and each time you go do it this week, you seek to do it to the honor of God, thinking and thanking him as you go. But how can you know that? How can you be sure when bad things happen, it's not being that you're not being abandoned by God, but that God is with you? Here's how. Matthew 12, verses 40. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now something greater than Jonah is here. Jesus is calling himself here the ultimate Jonah. In the story of Jonah, Jonah was sinning. He had been told by God to preach to Nineveh. Because of his racist attitude, he didn't want to go, and he runs away from God. He runs away, he gets into a boat with a bunch of sailors, like the pastor today, and God sends a storm. But it is a storm of God's wrath that is coming after Jonah. Jonah sees it, and he knows he deserves punishment. So he sees it's endangering the other sailors. So he tells them, throw me into the storm. Let it consume me, and you will be saved. And they do, and he's consumed by the storm. But when Jesus Christ says, I am the ultimate Jonah, do you know what he means? He means that there is a storm that you and I deserve. All human beings have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We do not love God with all our heart, mind, and soul and strength. We do not love our neighbors as ourselves. We deserve the storm of God's wrath. But Jesus is saying, If you believe in me, then you can know I took that storm. I took God's wrath for you. It fell into my heart. It consumed me so that you can be saved. I was abandoned on the cross. My God, why are you forsaking me? Jesus was abandoned in his suffering because he got the suffering we deserve, so that in your suffering, you can know that it's not punishment. Suffering is part of the brokenness of the world because of sin, and God is with you in it, and he will bring you out on the other side. When I was studying at Bible college, one of the best things that ever said to me was by a professor of mine. He knew I was one of those new up-and-coming pastors who thought I knew everything. I can save the world. He said this to me: when you're with somebody suffering, be it in a hospital, on the streets, or wherever, they don't need somebody with philosophical and theological arguments. They just need somebody with them. They just need somebody who cares and who's with them. Suffering is more than just a philosophical and theological question. It's a personal problem, because how are you going to get through it? You need somebody with you. And only Christianity, of all the religions in the world, says that God has been with us in our suffering. Only Christianity has claimed that God has suffered. Have you lost a child? So has God on the cross. Have you been betrayed? People stab you in the back? Are you experiencing pain in your body? Are you experiencing poverty and death? So has God. He has faced all those things. He is really with us in our suffering. And if you believe in him, the storm you're in is not punishment, but is part of the brokenness in this world that God is controlling to eventually bring good. And meanwhile, it can turn you into a Christ-like person. And that will happen if you know and believe that God is with you. I'm going to end off reading a part of an old hymn by John Newton, who we know very familiar-wise. He's the writer of Amazing Grace. This is what this hymn says. Begone, unbelief, my Savior is near, and for my relief will surely appear. By prayer let me wrestle, and he will perform. With Christ in the vessel, I smile at the storm. May you encounter God in a very powerful and personal way in your suffering, knowing that he is in your boat. He is in your storm. Blessings to you all. Thank you.